just because data is public doesn't mean you can do what you want with it.
But depending on your domain, it can be your main differentiating aspect from your competitors. What happens when a user asks you to remove their data and that data has passed through an AI model?
GDPR itself actually has quite a lot of rules on AI. There have been cases where providers have been told to destroy their model.
You always have to trust someone. So the question is, who do you trust? Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the NILG.AI podcast. Today we have Robert Baugh with us. He is the CEO of Keepabl, an end-to-end privacy management software, and the host of Privacy Kitchen, a YouTube channel around data privacy. And it's funny because Privacy Kitchen was one of our main references when we were trying to launch a YouTube channel for our company. We analyze their content, we take a lot of insights on their content, on how to produce content for B2B in the tech industry. So it's an honor to have you here, Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Kelwin. That's really lovely to hear, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. It has been amazing to see all the journey from watching your videos to having you on the podcast today talking about
And in
privacy.
the kitchen, in the privacy kitchen.
Exactly. Exactly. Which is it's amazing, especially since we are going to talk today about privacy, which is a key aspect in artificial intelligence. So it's great to have you here for our audience. So I would like to start with challenges. Okay, our channel is a lot of how to overcome, what are the main challenges and how to overcome them. Uh, in our case, about AI, but today we are going to talk about privacy. So, what are some challenges that you continuously see entrepreneurs face with privacy in general, both external or internal challenges?
That's a great question. So I think the key one there is entrepreneurs as well, because I think one of the challenges for entrepreneurs is the need to move fast. And one of the difficulties, one of the challenges about privacy is there's a lot of things to learn there. I mean, talk about everything that's coming out on AI. Privacy's just exploded since GDPR came through. So particularly since lockdown finished, the number of documents that are 50, 100 pages long that get issued every day on privacy just seems overwhelming sometimes. So one of the big challenges for entrepreneurs is how to manage that desire to move forward really quickly. And also entrepreneurs are aspirational. So they're looking to try and get large customers, large ticket sales. And those large customers as well are going, we need to be really careful about privacy. So you need to have a really good answer. So it can feel like this insurmountable thing that is sort of sitting there like, I want to get over there, but I've got this massive chain attached to my ankle. And I think that's one of the challenges for privacy professionals like myself and everyone in the industry about making it achievable, making it seem really easy and achievable. Easy is maybe too far, but we want to make it as intuitive and achievable as possible so they can achieve their goals.
Okay. And in general, I mean, nowadays, today we talk a lot about privacy in the sense of end customer data privacy. But there is also the internal component of privacy, which is the own company sensitive data privacy, trade secrets, trade information, which is not a recent thing. It's something that we have been trying to protect since always, right? So there are those dualities.
That's a very good point. I think a lot of people actually, when they're new to the world of data protection and privacy, whether we call it privacy, data protection, data privacy, we're all talking about the protection of the fundamental rights and freedoms of individuals through the protection of their personal data. And so let's just say privacy for that. I think a lot of people don't realize, even in quite sophisticated business people don't realize, as you say, the most sensitive data they tend to have is about their employees. They've got all the health data from wellness and sick leave. They've got all the financial data as well. So there's an enormous amount of data for internal usage. And I think one of the things that is very, very prevalent with privacy and with AI as well is the whole question of governance. And so having that governance in place is super important with that internal data and the external data as well.
Can you clarify the word governance? So if you have to explain governance in one sentence, what will be it?
Sure. So my definition of governance is everything that you do to ensure that you meet your legal, moral, ethical, and contractual obligations in a particular compliance regime, such as privacy or security.
Okay, so you mentioned legal, moral, and ethical, and then I
contractual.
Think and contractual,
which is you could throw that into legal, I suppose.
Into legal, yes. There's something quite relevant here, which is moral and ethical. And when we think about data privacy, we tend to think about it like, I have to comply with this regulation. But having a good data privacy in place also improves the brand perception your company has with the end market. So it's not just like this chain that is preventing you to move forward, but depending on your domain, it can be your main differentiating aspect from your competitors.
Absolutely. And actually, it's converting it from that feeling of there's a sort of chain holding them back to actually being something that is wind in the sails for their business. And if you look at Cisco, do some fantastic data privacy benchmark studies each year. And if you look at them, it's very, very consistent that 2/3 or more have had significant benefits, not just benefits, but significant benefits, including in things like a happier place for people to work. They feel very comfortable as employees going, we've got a place that has good moral and ethic handling of data, fantastic relationships with customers. Actually, a really efficient and innovative use of data is one of the significant advantages of good privacy, which almost seems a bit counterintuitive. But with privacy, what you're doing, because security is such a big aspect as well, and knowing where your data is and securing it, a lot of IT people that we speak to are so thankful for GDPR because finally it's a legal stick they can use to get the budget to do the projects they always wanted to do, to clean up data lakes, to clean up awful sort of, they know there's some grisly, skeletons in cupboards, but they've just not had the ability to go and touch them. And GDPR lets them go in and really get efficiencies in data, know what the data is. You get a lot higher quality connections with your customers, for example, as well as your employees. I mean, there's great stats. Often you hear the apocryphal sort of 25% of a database goes out of date every year anyway. So how long should you keep data for without properly gardening it and making sure it's accurate? So all of these things, actually, if you have good privacy compliance, those Cisco studies are fantastic for showing the ROI you get in some surprising areas.
Yeah, and in general, people think about investments in privacy and security just after they get
Yes.
a leak of data, or it's always like a reaction and never preventive
Yeah.
measurements. So I mean, in general, I'm more libertarian in the sense that I'm against most regulations, but I think some regulations have been good. For example, in the healthcare domain, for sure, and I think also GDPR is a good piece of regulation, for sure, that has created some awareness. First of all, in the general population, at least in Europe, like any young person nowadays talk about data privacy.
That's
Uh,
incredible. Yeah.
that is
I mean,
you don't see it.
I qualified, I started working in a law firm in 1993 and I qualified in 1995. So I've been doing this for quite a long time, and data protection has always been, 1995 was the year the directive came out from the European Data Protection Directive, and then our 98 Act. And really, you couldn't get people to do anything about it. People paid it lip service. There were never any enforcement actions. It was limited to £500,000, hardly ever happened anyway. No one really knew about it. Just put a privacy policy, say everyone consents to it, job done. Don't even bother keeping records. And then GDPR, with all the doubling of data every couple of years, or even faster now, with all the discrimination that can happen and around digital data and the profiling that can happen, GDPR rebooted with those huge fines. And the EU.AI Act has even higher fines. And the GDPR fines put it onto the risk register for all boards. And they just couldn't really ignore that. And all those rules in GDPR are actually 95% of them were there in the Data Protection Directive. And actually, some of that's quite interesting at the moment because some haven't gone so well through the different years. And obviously, GDPR applied it, though, to processors as well as controllers, and increased those fines, increased the obligation to actually to notify breaches to regulators, which previously was under a different law, and only for IT telcos and ISPs. And also, as you say, actually, I think lockdown did a lot to get a lot of awareness up, because people were thinking, do I want to give my name and address to a restaurant or a pub? What's protection around that? And just that's just one example, but all the different aspects around COVID testing, flights, having to put your details in, using face recognition often to try and make efficiencies here. And it threw, in that sort of short period of time, decade of technology advancement and awareness on data protection.
Yeah, I agree on that. And although we have more, let's say, awareness around data protection, the very basic data protection artifact that we have on the internet, which is the cookie banner, where we have to click or whether or not we accept or not. For most people, it's just accept everything or reject everything without even thinking about it. It's almost like a muscular memory. People just go there and accept or go there and reject, and that's like the very basic fundamentals. So still there is a road, an educational road that we need to create, and I think Privacy Kitchen
Yeah.
is doing a great job there also.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
So getting back to the challenges, there are
Mm,
general challenges entrepreneurs face, right, with privacy,
yeah.
mainly with this speed versus compliance. What about privacy on the age of AI? So what is different in AI companies, or
Mm, mm.
not necessarily fully AI companies, but when companies use AI around? So what's different in terms of privacy that was not before?
Sure. So expanding on those challenges entrepreneurs face generally, as more of a context for the AI challenges. So with you can't manage what you can't measure, is the old saying. So having a good data map, a good records of processing activities, or ROPA, is a key thing, and people are still struggling with that right now. To actually get a ROPA, records of processing activities, that is intuitive to update, easy to manage and to see. And that ROPA is really important because what that ROPA can mean a lot of different things. So what I'm talking about here from a privacy point of view is it's basically a register of all your processing activities. HR recruiting, we're processing about candidates. This we get CV data, financial data. We share it internally here. We maybe use an online HR tool to help us. We keep it for a year after they're not successful, and if they're successful as an employee, then it goes into the other processing activities of all the HR activities. And so you build that out, like use of cookies, as you mentioned, sort of doing trade shows, for example, managing sick leave, paying suppliers, all these different processing activities of where you're using personal data, who you're sharing it with, the life cycle of that personal data. That is in practice a big challenge for people, but it's necessary, because if you don't know where it is, you can't secure it. If you don't know who you're sharing it with, you can't make sure you have the right arrangements in place with them. And also, if you don't know what you've got, you can't. One of the big things is, which comes with AI as well, is how do you help people to actually exercise their rights to access, to correct, and to erase their data or port it. So that ROPA is really, really key. So that sort of is really one of the big issues for businesses right now, getting that, because that unlocks everything else. So then when you look at AI, then you're saying, well, there's such a rush to use AI. I'm reminded very much of back in 2007, I was at a company. We had an app on BlackBerry, which was the only smartphone out, and every screen was the same size. It was wonderful to develop for. But then iPhone came out in 2007, and suddenly everything just went crazy. And there was a big feeling in engineers of like, well, we can scrape the device and we can get all their, all the apps they're using, all their email addresses, and we can do this, and we can get this big picture of people to help them. And you're like, yeah, but you're not really helping you. That's really intrusive. And I'm feeling at the moment that there's such a push to use AI everywhere, that there's the counterbalance of, well, just because one can do something, should one do something? And so one of the challenges with AI and privacy at the moment is, I really want to use AI for this in my business. Am I appropriately considering the privacy risks around that? And it's not, and that's just from the privacy point of view. Am I making sure that I know that record of processing thing, what data is actually being involved? You've heard horror stories about people being able to get data out of AI, some training data, for example. By putting data in, are you into an input? Will that be used in any way and come out as an output for another party? So you've got a breach. Where is that data going if it's going outside the UK or the European Economic Area? Do you have the right processing arrangements in place with that company? All the sort of things we were talking about. How long are they going to keep it? If someone asks for their data and you put it into the AI, are you going to be able to exercise those rights, help those people exercise those rights with the AI? So these are all the things that are, from a privacy point of view, around the use of AI. And the other thing about privacy laws, in particular GDPR, is it's about the rights and freedoms of individuals. So it's not just about privacy, it's about not having discrimination or harassment, and financial loss, etc. So obviously, one of the big problems with AI is the risk of bias. and that is a GDPR risk as well. The GDPR can be a bit of an everything law. Obviously, you've got the Equality Act, etc., and all the different equality laws. So those are the AI exacerbates those ROPA questions, and that desire to move quickly.
Yeah, exactly. In general, we use a rule of thumb when we think about whether or not a data point should be in an AI model. And what we say is um, you shouldn't add a data point if it doesn't create value to the end user. So there is where I
Right.
put the threshold. But of course, for creating value, we need a way of measuring it. And it's
Mm,
exactly what you said. So try to create this data point, see if actually it creates value to the end user, measure it, validate, and then if it is not, if it doesn't, just remove it. I mean, with traditional machine learning systems, we have these very complex ETL pipelines where the boundary of when a data point stops being that data point and starts being something else that doesn't
mm,
longer correlate with the initial source of
right.
data is kind of blurry, right? Um,
Yeah, that's a big problem as well with AI in terms of, well, let me rephrase that. It's a big challenge with AI in terms of that way that AI can drift, AI can adapt and grow and change in positive and negative ways, in a way that, say, Excel doesn't or something. So when people are using different systems, often the change of those systems is pretty glacial. But with AI, the change in those systems, for good or bad, can be quite high. And as you say about the use of that data, it's really interesting because a lot of people I speak to in the world of AI, there's a lot of use of synthetic data to get those parameters up to massive amounts of parameters really easily. So the use of synthetic data is fantastic from a privacy point of view. And one thing that is an interesting one when we talk about AI, I think we mentioned this a little bit when we spoke before, was looking at the different players in the AI supply chain. So someone creating the AI model using training data, as you say, that question: does that data point provide value? Does that data point have to be personally identifiable? Can we use synthetic or pseudonymized or even anonymized? And then once you've created a model, is there data in there when someone's using it downstream, and are they putting information into the model? If they do, what happens to that? And those sort of questions about drift, as you go, well, did we actually train it on the right data for the usage? And that's something that the EU AI Act has quite a lot about, where you might train a model on this sort of data, and then you're going to be using it in this sort of data. So you've got to be live all the way through to continually assess, and that's one of the bigger challenges with AI, I think, than
yeah,
non-AI privacy.
yeah. And typically, I mean, with recommender systems, for example, or traditional classification models, it was,
Mm,
I will say, less risky in a sense that you put data in, but the output is is so simplistic. It's just a number that yes, you can you can have a biased behavior, but you wouldn't leak data
yeah,
from the model. But now with generative AI, you can actually leak data from the
yeah,
model to the end user, right? That's a major
yeah.
risk. It's not only the data that the user is, and the entry cost for passing this data is way lower now than before.
Mm,
That's
mm.
the other thing, right?
I think
So
that's really true. I mean, we spoke before I was on one. I was general counsel of a business where we were looking to use AI in health tech and medical devices, and the opportunities are absolutely fantastic. And that was around the time of the Moorfields Eye Hospital, for example, AI usage, where they got some super clean data, which was eye scans, and I think it was DeepMind. Basically was able to take all of these sanitized, as it was, data of these wonderfully clean eye scans and create a model with high accuracy to help the consultants determine who should be prioritized for treatment for eye disease. And that's like a really nowadays it feels like nowadays it's only a few years ago, it feels like a really contained example. But as you say now, with the use of Gen AI and people and things like ChatGPT, etc., it's so democratized and so easy to shove lots of information in without really knowing what's happening with the guardrails on that information.
yeah, and it's not just the customer information that you pass there to the prompts is also typically information from other customers that you use to feed this
Yeah.
prompt on how it should answer. And that other
Mm.
it's information from other patients, from other users, and also information from even from your internal operating procedure, from your standard operating procedures that sometimes people pass as part of the prompt without even realizing that the output can leak this kind of data, and that the validation that it's whether or not leaking this data is not, it's not something simple. It's not just a number. It's like rich text or images or video or audio, which you cannot be
Absolutely.
100% sure, right?
I think that's right. And also you've put your finger on it there, that we're not just talking about text data anymore. We're talking about so many different types of data, and there can be privacy impacts from all of that type of data.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And then, I mean, we are, you mentioned the right to forget your data, to remove your data, right?
Mm. Mm.
When we are training an AI model, you know,
Yeah.
when you are fine tuning an AI model, how feasible it is to guarantee the right to forget that data, especially when that model is something as large as a large language model that can basically memorize everything out there. So, is this feasible with LLMs, with Gen AI, that whenever a user removes a data point, it should be actually removed from the entire pipeline? Or this is more of a unfulfilled promise that we will have in the next 10, 20 years?
Well, that's a $1 million question, and you're probably
Right.
better. Well, you are much better placed to say whether it's physically possible or not than I am. But there have been cases where providers have been told to destroy their model because they couldn't. They either created it based on illegally obtained data, or they couldn't separate out the illegally obtained data. Um, and so there's an interesting UK law aspect of unjust enrichment. So also, if you look at CNIL's fantastic, we'll talk about sources later, but CNIL's great as well, the French data protection regulator. And they're very, very clear, as is all regulators, that when you train your AI, you've got to train it on legitimately obtained data. And obviously, privacy is one aspect. Just because data is public doesn't mean you can do what you want with it. There is a bit of a different view on publicly available data from the US and the UK. But there have been decisions where providers have been told to destroy their model. And I think this is one of the things that we're only at the very early stage of AI. So what happens when you deprecate AI? What happens when you move from one model to another model? What happens to your data there? What happens to if you decide as an organization to switch from one provider to another provider, or the next gen comes through? There's no end of history. It keeps on going. So there's going to be more and more amazing AI coming down the track.
Yeah. And then what happens, my main question here is, what happens when a user asks you to remove their data and that data has
Yeah.
passed through an AI model? Not necessarily in the way of prompting, because prompting doesn't store information, but in
Yeah.
the way of fine tuning that model and retraining that model. So how
So
feasible it is to actually remove
I
it?
think so. It's really about the personal data. So say I, if my data has been used to train a model, my data might be in the resulting model accidentally, which is going to be very difficult to identify and find, or it might deliberately be in the model still. Some AI does use personal data in the model as well, so that's easier to find. And you do have to find it, and you do have to delete it. If you've used the data to train a model, say for example, you've gone, these are, you know, men wearing black jumpers or whatever it is, we're both on this, and they've taken our pictures and used it to train a model. Our personal data will have been used to train a model, but the model itself won't contain our personal data. So I think it comes down to quite a technical view on, does the model actually have that personal data?
Yeah.
And then the difficulty, as we mentioned, is if you've trained a model on illegally obtained data, what happens to that model? Are you allowed to keep it or not? And I think
Yeah.
that's going to be a big thing.
Yeah, for illegally obtained data, I think the argument is pretty easy.
Yeah.
For legally obtained data where you no longer have consent, I think it's more blurry, especially because the boundary of until which point that's exactly your data, or when it was already being condensed in a neural network weights
Yeah.
that do not longer fully
Then that
represent the
probably
original
isn't
copy of the
your
data.
data if it's gone into a weight like that, I wouldn't have thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then of course you mentioned this thing that regulation is not necessarily regulation, but the interpretation of this regulation is changing quite fast. So
Mm.
whenever a company is trying to decide between a processor, which is one of your 10 steps to GDPR compliance,
Yeah.
which is identifying your processors, I have this constant question, which is, should we use OpenAI or a proprietary
Mm, mm,
model,
mm, mm.
AI model, or should we use an open source model uh, from Hugging Faces or whatever? My
So
answer typically goes
yeah,
with, you always have to trust someone. So the question is, who do you trust? What is your perception on that?
it's a very good answer. I agree with that, and I think I don't think open source or closed sources. I don't think either sort of by default is going to be less biased than the other. I think you have to look at I mean, obviously, open source you would hope would be more transparent and that there would be more information available on because a lot of the rules on AI in GDPR, and there are rules on AI in GDPR we can come to, and in obviously in the EU Act, are things about transparency and explainability. And you'd hope with an open source model, there's a lot more transparency and explainability, and there should be a lot more about what data it's been trained on and different data sets, etc. Than some private providers are notoriously shy on coming forward about data information about their models. So I don't think one necessarily is better than the other. I do think you're absolutely right. It's about the trust, and trust is a major word for responsible AI, trustworthy AI. These are the main things that come through. And so you have to look at it and see, even if it's open source or a private model, what's it been trained on? What sort of level of confidence do you have in that? How does it fit into your governance moving forward as well?
Yeah, yes, exactly. And in the end, if it is open source and you host it yourself, do you trust more your own engineers or uh, OpenAI or whatever provider engineer to keep the data private, right?
Well, this is it. I mean, you want one is entitled to believe your contractual counterparty. You don't have to sort of believe that they're going to be bad players, but it's a very interesting one. I think it's much easier, obviously, if you can keep it yourself in your own network
Yeah,
and host it yourself. But this is, I mean, looking at how the organizations I've always worked in through my life have been technology and or law firms. Now, it's been hard enough to get the skill set for privacy. The number of people who know what an API is and actually can use an API is probably still relatively low. And all of a sudden, we're talking about, this is one of the challenges for any organization. All of a sudden, we're talking about a level of expertise around artificial intelligence and machine learning, and about bias in data and bias in output and monitoring in and output for drift. This is really, really tough stuff. I mean, one can geek out on it massively, and it's a fantastically exciting thing if you're I did engineering back in the day. But for most businesses, say take 99.2% of businesses in the UK have less than 10 people, and 99.7% in the UK have less than 250 people. How are they going to get this level of expertise? They're going to have to stand on the shoulders of external people. I think it's the larger organizations who have the capability to build their own AI, host their own AI, take it forward, and maintain it, which has got to be the best way to do it.
yeah. And most of our leads are trying to implement AI for sure do not have the technical capabilities, sometimes of even handling an API, even less
Yeah,
an AI model or analyzing an AI model. So I always
exactly.
recommend them, like, let's keep it simple.
Yeah,
You have to trust someone. So I typically tell them, let's trust a proprietary tool that will support this compliance stuff long term. Okay,
yeah.
but still something that you have to assess. So where are the privacy
I
rules
think
of
that's a
this
very good
person?
point. And as an analogy to that, when Schrems 2 happened, and everyone was looking at, well, how can we, let's using US American providers was problematic under Schrems 2 for a period of time. And people were looking at European alternatives. And we were as well when we were Schremsifying our architecture. And you put your finger on it, because it's actually, there's a high amount of value of using a product that is well used, because it's got lots and lots of people who are basically stress testing it, beta testing it, bug fix it, bug notifying. And so if you have something, and those organizations have got larger teams for security, they've got larger teams for resilience, larger teams for bias, then sometimes the whole company of an alternative that's just started up. So those things are very valid in the
Okay.
trustworthy discussion.
And all competitors are trying to break it and to show the biases. So everything is kind of identified
Yes,
by the whole world, by the community.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a bit about regulation. Okay. So we
Mm.
had GDPR. Now the European Union is coming out with the AI Act, and in the US we have the executive order, and I'm pretty sure there will be other
Yeah.
legislation around AI. What's your general feeling around the AI Act? Is it complementary to the GDPR? Is it
Yeah, and actually talks about the GDPR a lot. So when you read so we apparently it's the final version that we've got now, but it could still not be, depending on how France can get a sort of
AI
a team
is
together.
evolving faster than legislation, so it won't be the final version in 6 months
Yeah,
if we
exactly.
have to change everything. So
Yes, absolutely. So I think the AI Act final draft that's just been out this week is basically refers to GDPR all the way through, and it also makes the point that there's lots of other laws out there that already apply to artificial intelligence. We mentioned equality laws about bias and harassment. You can't discriminate against people on certain bases, and that is applicable to AI, whether or not there's an AI Act anyway. So GDPR itself actually has quite a lot of rules on AI. And so the AI Act does talk about GDPR all the way through. And it does say nothing in the AI Act overrides anything around personal data from GDPR. Now, obviously, as you mentioned before, we talked a bit about as well, AI can be about, there's personal data and there's non-personal data. So as you mentioned, like source code, there's obviously the famous example of an organization that put its source code into AI, and then suddenly it was being, its confidential source code was being shoved out to other people. And there's lots of lawsuits going on about different coding usages as well. So it's not just about personal data, it's about all data. It's about what do organizations put into the different AI. And the EU AI Act, I think, is necessary. If you look at it, it's very focused on high risk AI. And if you're not high risk AI, it's pretty lightweight, really. You do high risk AI, you've got to register, you've got to do conformity assessments, you've got a CE mark and all this sort of thing. But the bar for high risk is relatively high. When you look at things like banned applications under the AI Act, which is a very interesting topic, a lot of them are, for example, if it's about trying to manipulate people to act in a way that they wouldn't otherwise, or trying to get vulnerable people, be that children or others, to act in a particular way to their detriment. It's all about substantial harm to them, not just. Now, it's an interesting question. So the EU AI Act has been watered down a fair bit from where it started. And so one might ask, well, why is it okay to put AI onto the market that intends to make a vulnerable person behave in a particular way, but it's just not, doesn't reach that bar of substantial harm to them? Why should you be able to create moderate harm to people? So there's a lot of discussion to come on the AI Act, but the GDPR is there as a bit of an everything law, particularly for AI. I think the US executive order is a really interesting one, because I think the UK was standing there going, we're going to be not legislating on this. We're going to be relying on existing law and existing regulators. And look, the EU is going very prescriptive. The US is being much more like us and laissez-faire. And then all of a sudden, the US comes out with this behemoth of an executive order, which has sort of put the UK now sort of between two stools, really, the US and the EU. And the US is romping ahead, and I think is going to be stealing a march on the UK. I'd see it very much like a sort of an EU plus, actually, on the US. I think that the executive order is very interesting, but the UK is going to have to start bringing itself up to speed.
Yeah, but when I hear about, for example, the EU AI Act, isn't everything here already covered by GDPR, IP protection? When we think about, for example, source code, it's already
Mm, mm,
copyright,
mm.
trade secrets, etc., and the general constitution. So I believe in some, I don't know in which law, but in most countries' law, you have something like you cannot intentionally bias some doing harm on someone.
Yeah,
So
that's
I
right. I mean,
think most of
there
these are
are
already
all these
already.
existing laws that are there. I do think, though. So, for example, there's the new AI office in the European Commission that's really focused on generally applicable AI, and so that generally applicable AI has become a separate part within the AI Act, and it's going to be really monitored by the AI office. I do think the AI Act is needed to give specifics for.
Yeah,
I mean, it talks about flops, it talks about systemic risk and this sort of thing as well. So it's putting in place structures that can then be tweaked. So we mentioned about adaptability going forward. Actually, the AI Act is pretty adaptable going forward in terms of lists of what's prohibited or lists of what's high risk. And the different offices and boards are going to be able to put forward codes and standards. Industries are going to be able to put forward their own codes that get approved, like under GDPR. It's a very, very familiar law to other EU laws there. And I think it's a bit like, say, the law on toys or the law on medical devices or the law, and it does talk about these other aspects, which obviously AI can be involved in. And so I do think it's relevant to have that.
yeah, as a separate one, because my main
Yeah.
question was, why not extending GDPR for AI? I mean, in a sense of unifying the two laws into a new version, right?
I think so. For example, I think if by analogy, if you look at the old e-privacy directive, well, it's still the e-privacy directive. It's 2002, and then updated in 2009, and they're trying to get the e-privacy regulation out now. And the intent was to have the e-privacy regulation out at the same time as GDPR, and it's still not out. And the e-privacy directive covers, as I mentioned a bit before, confidentiality and security of communications for CSPs and for communication service providers and ISPs, information service providers. So those are the guys who had the breach notification obligations back then under that e-privacy directive. It also covered the private sphere of your own device, so cookies and similar technologies, such as tracking pixels, etc. And that's a big argument point at the moment. It also went into value-added services and using traffic data, location data. And so the e-privacy directive actually covers quite a wide range of topics. And I think one of the difficulties with the e-privacy regulation and why it's not come through is it's just a massive panoply law. It covers so many different areas that you might have quite a good agreement on cookies, but that's not come through because everyone's talking about protecting children online or something, or the update to the security aspect, say, for example. And so I think if they split those out, we would be able to get more particular laws coming through. So I am in favor, and also the version of the AI Act looking at is like 200 odd pages, and so GDPR is already quite big. And so I think not everybody uses AI yet. So I do think it's quite useful to have these aspects in separate parts.
Yeah, and when you think, maybe people still do not see it in this way, but for example, when, let's say, we were talking about regulation of medical devices, right? The
Yeah,
regulation of medical devices protects two stakeholders: protects the end user, the patient, but also protects the company in some way, because if they follow these rules and they had all of these
yeah,
validations, follow the template that is specified in the legislation, up to a certain point they get some level of protection themselves, that they did due diligence on the process
yeah,
of rolling this
yeah.
out, this medical device, for example. For AI suppliers, I think that will be also the case, but of course it can slow down a bit innovation around these tools until these rules become like uh, impregnated into our brains of how we build AIs, right?
I think that's right. I think there is a bit of friction. I mean, economists always talk about things like frictional unemployment, frictional change. I think there is a bit of friction potentially at the moment as people get used to these laws, and these are massive laws. I mean, that is one of the challenges to everybody at the moment, lawyers and product providers and everything. Is look at all the European Digital Data Act laws that have come through. You've got the package, you've got DSA,
Yeah.
DMA, DGA. Also, it's just and look at our. I think the Ofcom, the UK's Ofcom issued some guidance on the Online Safety Act, and I think it's 1,500 pages. Their first lot of guidance. So people to get through all this and work out what applies to you and how you have to deal with it, that itself, it's going to take a few years for this to come through. On the speed of it, I am very positive about the fact that if you get into it and establish what the rules are for yourself, because I was a general counsel of a company where we were going for medical device, including AI, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't develop wastefully, because you want to make sure that you can show that you had good governance across your whole development cycle. Once you've got that, you can do that quite quickly, and then you can move very quickly forward as well. So I think a lot of it as well is risk-based. It's appropriate. Quite a lot is well-known uh, risk assessments, measures and safeguards. I do think while there is a level of uncertainty at the moment, if you go from first principles on these sort of things, I think you can still move forward pretty quickly. Yeah, and I think it
And still,
benefits the development.
we are on this road of, it will take, I don't know, 10, 20 years to make people super conscious on these aspects. And you're doing a great job on Privacy Kitchen,
Thank you
educating
very much.
people
And yourself as well. I
around
have
this.
to say your channel is
Thank you.
fantastic. I
Thank you.
really enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you. But I think there is also a cultural part of it, whether it's from at the cultural, demographic level on each nation, but also internally on each company. Each company has a certain culture, which up to a certain degree comes
Yeah.
from the countries where they live. How do you create a data privacy culture inside a company?
Obviously, we've seen cultural war in OpenAI with played out, sadly not publicly enough because everyone wants to know more about what happened, but we could see the ramifications being played out. And I think that you're absolutely right. It's an interesting one. While there is a huge cultural difference around so many things in business, in privacy, etc., there is a harmonization on data protection rules and what's important worldwide on that. And interestingly, we're doing some project on AI principles. When you look at the AI principles around the world, they're pretty well the same 7 ones everywhere around the world. And so this is really heartwarming, I think. Then within that, and if you look at GDPR, it actually, it wasn't GDPR that spurred it. It was the explosion of digital data around the world spurred everybody, parliaments, legislatures around the world to put in place data protection laws, and GDPR was there as a fantastically new, updated version to adopt. And I think with the AI Act, people are looking at that. Everyone's moving very quickly on the same principles, which is leading us towards the same aspect on that. So that's positive. I think from a company point of view, I actually think so much comes down to the founders as to the actual culture of the company. And then this is where I think it's very important that the competition authorities have a look at this, at the growth of different companies. You look at the amount of number of companies that are invested in by FAMGA, Facebook and Google, etc. It's quite remarkable. And so they've got a power to, those organizations, those investors have got a power to make sure that those AI principles are followed. Competition authorities, there's a lot of soft power from governments, particularly like the UK Bletchley Park one, for example, before the executive order came out in the US, the meeting of 7 at the White House, etc., to put these principles in place for AI. And then the way to do it, I think actually there's the Global Privacy Assembly in 2020 came out with a list of ways that you could put measures in place for a privacy culture embedded with AI. And it's all around the sort of things we were talking about. It's around looking at what data you're going to use. Is it necessary? You mentioned minimization. We talked about pseudonymization and anonymization, or maybe using synthetic data. We talked about assessments. We talked about whether you have it internally or externally, what information you put in and don't put in, monitoring it going forward. All of these things are the ways that you can put in place a really, really good culture. And I think what's really heartwarming as well is everyone's talking about it.
Yeah,
It's such a great moment because
yeah,
there's a big compliance awareness around these tools at the moment.
yeah. At least in Europe, and there is the tricky part here, which
Right.
is there are these 7 artifacts. Europe, US, for example, but there are these 7 artifacts that you are mentioning, but these are like hard rules. But then there is like the implicit culture of each nation. For example, I am from Venezuela, right?
Mm-mm-mm.
And in Latin America, data privacy is not something people talk much about it, right? Unless, for example, in Venezuela, people only values data privacy. I don't know, because we are afraid of being kidnapped, right? But not
Right.
because of
Right.
we are afraid that the company is going to steal that data. When you come to Europe, you see a much larger general awareness of data privacy around
Mm-mm.
the general population that then gets reflected into the companies, because that's the culture that the company lives
Yeah.
in the end, which is the type of perception that the employees and the founders have around data privacy. And then, for example, we are in Portugal, and Portugal is 10x more aware of data privacy than Latin America. But when we work, for example, with German companies, we see another 10x
Yeah.
awareness
Yeah. Yeah.
on
Yeah.
data privacy and principles. Actually, I went to a
Mm.
conference last year or 2 years ago. I was a speaker at a conference in Germany, and they asked me to write a consent agreement for them saying I was going to be a speaker at the conference.
Right. Right.
And I told him
Right.
like,
Yeah.
yes, you
Yeah.
can put there my name. I accepted being a speaker here. And now you
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
sign this NDA
Yeah.
consent agreement. I'm like, man, I'm here. I'm going to talk. No worries about the NDA, about the consent agreement. And we are going to
Yeah.
put your name on the website, so you have to sign. So
For sure.
first time that happened to me, it was in Germany. And we work a lot with
Mm-mm.
German companies, and you see this massive awareness and this massive understanding and interest on data privacy. So the only
Mhm.
clients that I have that are data privacy first and without exceptions are German at a whole different level.
It's a
So
different
you get a
level.
new yeah, like you get a new
I do
project.
think that
It's
the if I may, I think you look at Brazil, you look at with the new law coming through the LGPD, you look at
yeah,
Argentina's revamping its laws, it's got an adequacy
yeah.
decision. Uruguay's got an adequacy decision. You go through to look at say Kenya, South Africa. You look
It's
at
spreading. It's spreading. Yes,
it's
for sure.
massively spreading, and that
Yeah,
the cross-border privacy rules that are now the global cross-border privacy rules came from an Asia Pacific initiative. There weren't that many companies that signed up to them, but it was an Asia initiative. Australia is doing a massive revamp of its laws. New Zealand has the adequacy decision. Korea's got an adequacy decision. So is Japan. So I think that adequacy decision being a decision by the European Commission that the data protection rules there provide an adequate level so that data can transfer from GDPR land of European Economic Area to somewhere else without any other safeguard in place. So I do think that I do get what you're saying. I do think there is a European centric way that one can look at things. I think the other thing around it on AI is, well, it costs a lot to build your own AI and to actually, so depending. I mean, obviously, depending on there's different ways you can do it, but so I think Europe is behind the US and China, and I think a lot of other areas are quite a long way behind the Europe then. And then I've heard a lot about Middle East money going in to create Middle East AI powerhouses. So it'd be interesting to see that come through. But if you're going to create your own large language model or other large model, you need a lot of money to have a lot of GPU time to create something. So I think that potentially will flow through. I think that's what's interesting then is it doesn't cost much, as you say now, to use it. It's very easy to use it, and I think that's going to be the interesting clash.
yeah. I think it tends to be like a almost zero entry cost for start using it, and then
It's
it's
getting to
elastic
that now, yeah.
on the
Yes,
usage.
yes, yes,
So, which is the
yeah,
most beautiful part.
yeah,
It's like in a few hours you can already have a demo, at least, maybe not a full protected final version safe AI process, AI enabled process, but it's pretty easy to get something nowadays out there
And that's
as a
that's
proof of
one of the
concept.
that's one of the things we were talking about speed, you see. So for example, if you look at the NIST AI risk management framework, then what you do is you put the governance in place first. And so you put the team together, you look at what's important to you, you get the resources available, etc. And then you map it out about, well, what risks are there from what we're going to be doing, who's going to be involved, what's the flow of it all, and what sort of harms are we looking at. And then you map it, then you measure it out. So you go, right, let's go and measure those and see what sort of risks we're going to be facing. And then you manage it. And so you put in place appropriate systems to
Mitigation
manage
plans.
those risks and to make sure you go going forward. None of that is there when you can get up and running in a couple of hours. And so this is that exact tension that there is of, well, I mean, there's a car company in the US I mentioned that had a chatbot on its website and AI powered, and they managed to get it to say that other car companies' trucks were better and all this sort of thing.
Yeah,
And so there's a lot of unintended consequences if you go with speed, and there's a lot of desire to have speed, and compliance people are already under quite a lot of pressure to enable business rather than be people who say no. So it's an exciting but difficult time.
yeah, yeah. Something that I am nowadays enforcing even more than before, especially because of the type of technology we are handling now with Gen AI, is do not leave privacy and data protection to the end of the project to get approval of the data protection officer to roll out, but involve them at the beginning of the project,
Yeah.
like right at the beginning,
Yes.
especially with Gen AI, because that will be the major risk you will be facing. So we have talked a
Absolutely.
lot about the landscape of data privacy, both in terms of companies and regulatory. Tell me a bit about Keepabl. So what do you do? How are you differentiating into this landscape, into this market?
Fantastic, thank you. So Keepabl is award-winning privacy management software, and the reason that I founded Keepabl, so I was general counsel of VC-backed SaaS companies for just over a decade, and before that, I was a technology lawyer in private practice in big city firms in London, Hong Kong, and Melbourne. I actually had to go at a privacy startup in Melbourne in 2001. I got my entrepreneur visa the day the dot-com bubble burst, so that was an interesting time. And before that, I did an engineering economics management master's. And so I've had a sort of, my trend has always been about moving into technology and into entrepreneurship. So when I was actually looking at a different business in 2017 to do a roll-up strategy in MSP market in the UK. And everyone was talking about GDPR coming out in 18 and was going, well, how do we deal with this? And customers were asking MSPs, will you do this for us? And most MSPs were going, no, because we don't know enough about it and we know there's a lot of risk there. And I thought, well, why aren't they using SaaS to deliver this? Because it's the perfect delivery mechanism. And the only one that was around at the time was this big company that it was so complicated. I thought I was looking at a DevOps interface. I thought if I don't want to use this, no one's going to want to use this. So that I can bring something different to the market with my weird crossover experience of being the external advisor, the internal person in charge of it, and having to put in place understandable, achievable compliance for a various different complicated regimes, including data protection, and that people can go, yep, we can do this and understand this. And then also, because we were aspirational, we were talking about entrepreneurs earlier, we were going for investment, we were going for bigger and bigger customers. We wanted to take that compliance work and show it to people to enable the business. That is in the accountability principle in GDPR. So suddenly I was looking at the market going, I can bring something very different here. And I chased the ideal of making it so simple that someone with no idea on privacy could actually do it all through Keepabl. That's an unachievable ideal, but we got as close to that as we think we can, and we get a lot of feedback from our customers about that. We've been in the RegTech 100 global list 3 years running for our innovation. We've got customers from small startups through to listed groups. Most of our customers are UK based with international, and then 30% is split between the rest of Europe and into the US. And we're seeing more and more international aspects now. We're now available in 5 languages, shortly to be 6. And the people I've noticed that are coming to us more are the people who are going, like we talked about at the beginning, it's hard to just get a ROPA done. And it's very easy to talk. And the reason I did Privacy Kitchen is people were saying to me in sales calls, oh, great, can you tell me about this? Can you tell me about this? Because they understood that I'd done general counsel before. And I thought, well, how can I leverage that and make that available for people? And one of the things that people are saying is a lot of the webinars go so over your head because it's all about what's the latest thing or managing some real esoteric point. And they just want to know, what's a controller? What do I do about a breach? How do I prepare for a transfer? How do I deal with it? And so that's what the whole ethos is for Keepabl, and it's reflected in Privacy Kitchen. Our start with the why from Simon Sinek is to joyfully use tech to solve people's headaches and make them feel happier. And then how we're doing that is really intuitive compliant SaaS.
Perfect. So you're basically accelerating the learning curve for any
Yeah.
entrepreneur around being
Yeah.
data private compliant. So
Absolutely.
let's do a 1 minute acceleration on for any entrepreneur that wants to be compliant with data privacy. What are the most common 3 errors you find on startups around data privacy?
I think with startups, it's not putting in place early enough the right, appropriate, scalable situation. Just having an eye that going forward, you're going to want to have some meatier processes in place that you can actually show people stuff. I think that's probably errors 1, 2, and 3 for most entrepreneur startups.
Perfect. So thank you, Robert, for being here. I would like to wrap up with 3 sources that you will recommend for anyone getting into this world of data privacy.
Fantastic, thank you. So data privacy and AI. So my sources really are things like LinkedIn is a massive source now. I follow people on privacy and on AI that I respect. You can find them really easily. And on I think LinkedIn is a fantastic source to really get to keep ahead. You got to garden it properly. Also, I really enjoy the CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority's website. I think they do some fantastic stuff. I do like the UK Data Protection Authority's website as well. And I think those really are the sort of the 3 areas I get most of my information from. And through LinkedIn, you then start looking at different places as well. So I would go with those 3 as my sources.
Perfect. And of course, it's weird if you say it, but I can say it. Also, you can watch the videos from Privacy Kitchen, which are a very good source of information
Sorry,
for
and
all
your
of you.
YouTube channel obviously is a big source for
Yeah.
me. So AI, anyone wanting to know about AI, definitely
Hey,
look at your channel. It's fantastic. I really enjoy it.
thank you, Robert. Any final word to wrap up with this episode?
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for having me. I think what I would say is to people not to panic. That it is, if you go from first principles, it's all very familiar. It's you go, what's the risk we're looking at? What's the data we're using, whether it's personal or not? What's the best way for us to use this? Is it appropriate? Do we need to be using this? Do we use something else? If we're going to be using this, how can we show to people that we've done the homework before we started using it? So just make sure you do some homework before you start using it. It doesn't have to take forever. And this is a constantly evolving area, and just do keep an eye on that.
Yeah. So privacy is not something you do once, one shot. It's something that you have to keep constantly adapting and
Absolutely.
constantly improving on that line.
Absolutely. It's a constant thing. And privacy, and actually just in the same way with AI, you have to keep looking at model drift and everything. With privacy, you have to it's sort of going old school on it. If you look at, say, 27001, the old ISO on security that's been around forever, you look at a 3-year certification period, and then within that 3-year, you're going to touch everything. And so some things you might touch every quarter, like how many non-conformities have we had, etc., what audits we're going to be doing. And then you decide what you're going to be touching at different times. Something you might only touch once, some every year, once every 3 months, what have you. And with privacy, you want the same thing. You want to go, okay, I'm going to look at my data subject requests and breaches every quarter. I'm going to look at my processes, say every 6 months, or I'm going to look at my impact assessments on an annual basis. All this, and you can filter that into a nice ongoing continual improvement strategy.
Amazing. Thank you. So thank you, Robert, for being here. And thanks to all the audience that watched this episode. I'm pretty sure you gained some very very relevant insights around the data privacy area.
Thanks, Kelvin.
Thank you
Thank you for
all.
having me.
Thank you.